Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Schickman, and I'm the managing partner at Lengea Law. This video is going to answer one of the most common questions that we get from our clients. And that question is how to find a medical director for my medical spa or IV hydration business. So far, we've helped over 1,200 clients in the aesthetic space alone start these types of companies, find medical directors, and make their business thrive as much as possible. And finding a medical director is one of these key questions that applies to pretty much any person who's starting a healthcare business. So in this video, I'm going to go over our top 15 tips on how to find the right medical director for your business. So the first question or the first tip is, how do I find a medical director? Is it hard? And what's the easiest way to do that? So finding a medical director is somewhat difficult, but not impossible. And I say that because a lot of us come into contact with different doctors. Like if someone's a nurse, probably in the hospital, you have relationships with your supervisor and there are doctors around. But in the hospital break room, coming up to your boss and saying, do you want to be my medical director for my new MedSpa, becomes a sort of question that you may not want to get into while you're working at the hospital. At the same time, we may have friends and family who are doctors that we also may or may not want to talk to about this. And there are lots of doctor professional services where they have doctors on demand who are willing to be medical directors. So there are ways to get medical directors. You could also talk to a law firm like us, and we have lists of medical directors available in every state that we work in. But the question becomes, is this medical director going to be a right fit for you? And how do you find that? So we're going to go over that in the video. One question that comes up is, let's say you're a nurse practitioner or a physician assistant. Do you still need a medical director if you're starting a medical spa or an IV hydration business? And that really depends on your state. So in some states, nurse practitioners or physician assistants have full practice authority. So there, you may not need a medical director if you fit in some criteria. But in most states, even if you are a nurse practitioner or a physician assistant, you would still need a medical director. They may have a different scope of duties, but they would still be necessary. There's also an added complication depending on whether your state has a prohibition called the Prohibition on the Corporate Practice of Medicine. And that's a mouthful, but essentially what that means is in those states, you can't directly hire a medical director. You need a legal structure called a management service organization and a management services agreement. And we could set that up for you. So even if you're in one of those states that has this prohibition, we could still help you. It's just that the legal setup will be a little bit different. Another question that we get is, let's say you're an esthetician or you're a business person. Can you still find a medical director and enter into a healthcare business that way? Yes. And that's usually done through this MSO, MSA structure. So even if you're an esthetician and you're looking for a medical director, or you're a business person and you want to get into the healthcare space, we can still help you. It just requires a very specific legal structure, and it depends on the state. Each state has its own unique requirements. So you just have to be sure that however you're setting things up works not only nationwide, but also for your state. So there are federal laws that you have to comply with, but also you have to comply with the state laws. Another tip here is, how often does the medical director need to be at your medical spa or at your IV hydration business? Do they have to be on site? And the answer in most states is they don't. So in most states, legally, the medical director does not have to be physically present on the premises. So it depends on the state, but let's say we're talking about New York. So in New York, for example, the medical director doesn't physically have to be there as long as you have the right kind of providers there in person. So that's a really state-specific question. But some states say that the medical director has to be a resident of that state. Some states say that the medical director has to be a board certified or board eligible derm or plastic surgeon. So the requirements of who can be a medical director in each state are a little bit different. Another question that comes up, and this is the million-dollar question, is how much should you pay the medical director? And today, and this is in 2024, the market rate for a medical director supervising a small startup med spa or IV hydration business is between $500 and $1,500 a month. So it depends on how busy you are, what procedures you're doing, how many people they're supervising. But we've seen medical directors as low as $300 a month, and we've seen medical directors as high as $3,000 a month, really depending on the type of practice, the type of medical director, and what you're going to have them do. Which brings us to the next tip. What does a medical director do? Do they have any ongoing responsibilities, or is it just formality? And it's not just a formality. The medical director does have real responsibilities. So that person provides the medical oversight for your whole practice. So they are medically responsible for everything that happens. So one thing you can do is you would have a set of protocols that you and the medical director agree to, and you and the medical director sign. You would have quarterly or monthly trainings or meetings with the medical director. You would call your medical director if you have any complications. So those are the typical medical director duties. A lot of these could be done remotely, but as a best practice, even if you're in a state that doesn't require in-person medical directors, I would suggest at least doing a quarterly visit to your location, meeting with the medical director, having them give you suggestions on improvement. And whenever you're doing trainings for like injectables or fillers or IV hydration, see if you could include the medical director in them. Meaning, if it's an online training, send them the link as well. Make sure they keep their certificate of completion, and you do also. Because if there's ever a board investigation, one of the things that gets asked for a lot is, okay, show me all of your certificates. Show us that you and your medical director know what you're doing. So the next question here is, okay, the medical director has these duties. What about good faith exams? Should my medical director be the one doing good faith exams, and is that standard? Most of the time, we see that the medical director does not do the good faith exams. Typically, they're done by a nurse practitioner, a physician assistant, someone on site, or by telemedicine, or people use a third-party outsourcing company to do these. And we can introduce you to those once you become our client. But typically, the medical director would be a medical director to multiple med spas, and then each med spa would have their own NP or PA doing the good faith exams. That's the most common structure. So the next question is, okay, let's say I found a medical director and they work in a hospital. What should I watch out for? It's important to note that if someone's working in a hospital, typically they have an employment agreement that prohibits them from doing anything medical outside the hospital. So typically they would need to ask permission to work at a med spa, even if they're a remote medical director. So if you're speaking to someone in a hospital, and even if they agreed, just make sure that their contract with the hospital gets reviewed by a lawyer, because sometimes a medical director might sign up, and then a month later they figure out, oh no, I can't work here. So make sure that someone reviews their contract. Another tip here is, how do you make sure that the legal setup you have with your medical director is compliant? And there's no way around this. You need to have it checked by a lawyer. Ideally, your medical director would have a lawyer that they work with or be knowledgeable in the law themselves. And if they don't, if you're a client, we're happy to talk to them for you. So really important, because liability really goes to the medical director in these situations, for the medical director to really understand what they're signing up for and what the responsibilities of every person are. The next tip has to do with training. So can the medical director provide training to your staff, and what kind of training? Typically, the medical director should attend any training that you're doing. So if you have the opportunity to go do some training, if possible, and if it's possible in the price, of course, bring the medical director with you so that you can both show that you have training and experience in these procedures. A lot of states have an explicit requirement that says the medical director has to have training and competency in the procedures they're supervising. So it's going to be really important to have those certificates of completion of whatever training that they did. Which brings us to the next point. So what qualifications or what kind of degree does your medical director need to have? A lot of medical directors are internal medicine doctors or gynecologists or emergency medicine doctors. So it's not that the medical director necessarily has to be an aesthetics expert or derm or plastic surgeon in most states. What they do need is training and competency in the procedures they're supervising. So make sure, like I said in the previous tip, that you keep the training certificates on file. The next point is, does the medical director have to live in your state? And this depends on the state. Some states have explicit requirements. For example, states like Colorado or Georgia, let's say the medical director has to be a resident in that state, whereas some other states don't. So check with your lawyer to make sure that the medical director you picked really works for what you are looking for them to do and the state that you're in. Next is insurance. So what kind of insurance is needed and who pays for it? This is really a negotiable point. Some states have a mandatory insurance requirement. They say every medical practice has to have malpractice insurance. Some states don't have this requirement, but it's an absolute best practice to have insurance because one lawsuit could be catastrophic if you don't. And insurance for this industry is relatively inexpensive. So definitely get insurance. We could put you in touch with a couple of different brokers who are excellent. So I would definitely recommend having it. And then who pays for it depends on what you guys negotiate with your medical director. Many medical directors have their own insurance, some don't. But if you're paying someone a relatively small amount of money, like $500 a month, a lot of times they would expect that you would put them under your insurance policy. And it typically won't be very expensive to do so. The last point is, what happens if your medical director disappears or becomes sick or can no longer be your medical director? You have to have a contingency plan. In many states, there's a requirement that if your primary medical director is not available, you have to have a substitute. So some states have that explicit. And even in the states that don't, you should always have a backup just in case so that you don't have to put your business on hold or freeze your bank account until you find a new medical director. Always have someone else in the pipeline so that you could be protected in case something happens to your medical director. The last tip is, what kind of questions should you ask when you're meeting with a medical director? And we have a whole guide on this with some sample questions, how to send them emails with templates. But typically you want to ask, A, are you taking on new clients? B, what are you looking to do and how much do you charge? Or you could present to them like, this is what I want you to do and this is what I'm offering. And then C, what kind of training do you have in these things that you're going to be overseeing? And are you willing to learn if you, let's say you don't have extensive experience? A lot of times, many people are willing to learn, even if they don't know the area right now, but it's always better to ask ahead of time to avoid complications. And then another important question to ask is, are you going to do my good faith exams, or do you expect me to find someone else to do them? That's a big area of misunderstanding sometimes, where people get a medical director and then they're like, well, okay, here, do these good faith exams. And the medical director says, well, no, that's not part of the job. So those are the top 15 things that people ask us about medical directors. Hopefully that's helpful. And if you guys have any other questions, you could always reach out to us. Our website is lengealaw.com, and we love helping you. So thank you very much.